Thank you all for joining us. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. You can submit questions online at sly.do using the code S952. That's sli.do, and we'll have the Q&A session following the panel presentations.
Welcome to Stanford's Learning Summit on Climate Change Resiliency. I am Famida Banger, Director of Stanford's Office of Sustainability. Thanks to all of you for coming together online to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day in such a unique and resilient way. As we all cope and learn through this pandemic, it is a privilege to be part of such a great learning community on this humble occasion. Stanford alumnus Dennis Hayes co-organized the nation's first Earth Day in 1970, and in Stanford's opening event yesterday, organized by the Woods Institute for the Environment, we heard his remarks on the importance of coordination for building momentum. Carrying that spirit forward, today's Learning Summit brings to you the best practices on climate resiliency policy, planning, and action. We chose this topic of climate resiliency with a sense of progress and responsibility. I say progress because many organizations have actively planned and mitigated their carbon and resource footprint in the last decade. At Stanford, for example, interdisciplinary research and teaching have given rise to about 440 faculty members teaching over 1,000 courses related to environment and sustainability across Stanford's 7 schools. Last year alone, 5,200 students graduated from a degree program with the sustainability as a learning outcome. On campus premises, we have fully electrified our energy system, and the dynamic system has reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 72%, soon to be 80% within about a year. We also chose this topic of climate resiliency with a sense of responsibility because collectively we have about a decade to mitigate and prepare for the impacts of a substantially altered global and regional climate with many impacts: heat, fire, flood, storms, and disease that will test our physical, social, economic, and personal infrastructure and preparedness. We must build up our resiliency, and resiliency is a concept as broad as it is deep. So we have much to build on, share, and do. We have invited a panel of local and regional experts on the various aspects of this topic who will share some highlights of their policies, research, tools, and practices. I want to thank Stanford Video and my Office of Sustainability colleagues behind the scene as they keep this panel going for us today and collect your questions. We also thank you, all of our participants, for your patience and understanding as all our presenters connect with us from different locations and circumstances. So let's begin our panel. Our first speaker is Nuntara Key to introduce our Golden State's policy and goals on climate resiliency. Ms. Key is the Deputy Director of Climate Resilience at California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Ms. Key provides the policy guidance on climate adaptation and resilience with specific focus on better aligning state and local policy, funding, research, and programming in support of local implementation. She facilitates ongoing collaborative partnerships with state and federal agencies, including NOAA, USGS, and FEMA. Please welcome Ms. Nuntara Key.
Thank you so much, Famida, and to the organizers for the invitation to join today. It's really wonderful to join the community here on this event, in spite of the current circumstances. So I just want to send a very warm thank you for everybody for joining. So as was mentioned, I'm Nguyen Tara Key. I'm Deputy Director for Climate Resilience in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And I'm going to provide today a high-level overview of the state's kind of framework, policy framework around climate resilience. It's my slide. So in California, I'm going to first recognize that we take an integrated approach in how we think about our climate response. So as many joining here today, I'm sure are well aware, California is committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and committed to meeting very ambitious reduction goals. We also, over the last many years, have started to focus on really ensuring that we're also preparing for the impacts that Californians across the state are and will continue to experience, and the importance of investing in both adaptation and resilience efforts to do that. And then third here on the slide is a recognition of the importance of continued investment and support for research and science-informed decision-making. So just as a quick frame that, when we talk about the state's approach on climate, we're really bringing these different pieces together really to support an integrated approach. So as I'm sure many people here joining today are well aware, but California is a place of extremes. The state, experiences, given the diversity of landscapes and ecosystems and communities across the state, experiences most climate impacts, from wildfire to drought, extreme flooding and precipitation, extreme heat. So what's on the slide here is just a few key findings from California's fourth climate change assessment that was released in 2018 of some of the anticipated or projected impacts we will see in the state if we do not meet certain emissions reduction goals. So for example, here, by 2050, we could see heat waves in cities that could cause 2 to 3 times more heat-related deaths if we don't reduce emissions, impacts to our water supply, as well as, increases in area burned for wildfire. So just a couple quick examples here. But luckily, in California, we have a history or legacy of strong leadership on climate change. And this, by no means, is a reflection of all of the policies, whether executive orders or legislation that has been passed over the years, but just a snapshot of some of the key foundational kind of framework legislation and executive orders that have helped California chart a way on path on our climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation efforts. So a couple key notes that I want to make here on this slide, and I'll touch on these in my remaining slides here, but I wanted to highlight the, in addition to meeting emissions reduction goals, that there is legislative direction for the state to develop an adaptation strategy that was signed into law through AB 1482. There's also direction for state agencies to incorporate climate into planning and investment decisions. And that came through both a series of executive orders, one of which was signed in 2019 by Governor Newsom, Executive Order N1919. But there's also legislation that codifies some of that work as well in AB 2800. Again, pointing to the importance of continued investment in science and research. The climate assessments were established through an executive order. And then lastly, I want to highlight on here, in terms of state action, the Senate Bill 246, which created the Adaptation and Resilience Program that is in our Office of Planning and Research. And really our charge through this enabling legislation is to support alignment of state and local efforts on adaptation and support the coordination that is needed in order to align our efforts, but really supporting and looking at supporting local implementation. Lastly, here on this slide, I just want to highlight that local governments also have obviously a very critical role in both implementation, but also leading the way in our planning efforts. And so there is a bill, Senate Bill 379, that requires local governments to incorporate climate into their general plans. And so we work quite a lot with our local partners across all of those different areas, and especially providing guidance on SB 379. So as we look to, so that's a bit of a kind of policy landscape framing background there. So as we look to our priorities in our office and thinking about our resilience priorities, I want to highlight a few quick things here in the interest of time. So one is that we recognize that a resilient California is one where no communities are left behind, and that we must work to ensure that our adaptation and resilience actions promote equity, foster community resilience, and protect the most vulnerable. And one area of work that we have been very focused on through our office is really trying to better articulate and better understand what it means to define vulnerable communities in the context of climate adaptation. Climate adaptation is something that is an emerging field of practice and is something that I think many local, regional, and state governments are working to incorporate in, and understanding what drives the underlying factors that are driving vulnerability and then how those factors are affected by climate impacts is an area of top priority for us in our work in our office, but also in partnership with our state and local government partners. Another priority for us is focusing in on how do we really institutionalize and incorporate physical climate risk, so understanding those physical risks from climate impacts, into our investment decisions, especially around our assets, so the built and natural assets and infrastructure. And so I mentioned earlier Executive Order N1919, which was again signed by Governor Newsom in 2019. And through that effort, our office has been really thinking about how we can better incorporate, again, physical risk into asset and investments. So the last point here that I want to highlight in terms of the state's approach on climate resilience is really recognizing the need to support a community of practice throughout the state, and really recognizing the capacity building and technical assistance support that is needed in communities across the state in order for us to really start incorporating climate adaptation and resilience into policy and decision making, and also really driving implementation on the ground. So again, through our charge in the Office of Planning and Research, through our adaptation program, we built and maintain the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which you can see the web address here. It's resilient with a T, ca.org. We welcome everyone to take a look through the site, and hopefully you'll find valuable resources for your work. In addition to providing this online resource, we really recognize the important role that the state plays in providing guidance, actionable decision support tools, and other capacity building resources that local governments and communities need across the state. One of the areas, lastly here, that I want to mention that we are focusing on is this really important bridge between emergency response and recovery. And in our role in our office, we do engage in and help lead some of the long-term recovery work for this state. And one of our priorities is really thinking about how we incorporate resilience thinking into our long-term recovery work, which, you know, in these times is increasingly important for us to be thinking about. So with that, I will hand it back over to Famida. And thank you all again for having me here. It's great to join.
Thank you so much, Ms. Key. We will get rolling as we have a series of topics built in sequence. So our next speaker is Professor Sally Benson, who is the co-director of Stanford's Precourt Institute for Energy. a professor in the Department of Energy Resources Engineering and School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. She researches technologies and pathways to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including geologic storage of CO2 and energy systems analysis for a low carbon future. She also directs Stanford's Global Climate and Research Project. Professor Benson has been a longtime collaborator and driver of campus energy programs and university's living laboratory initiatives. Welcome, Professor Benson.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Famida, and and thank you very much for organizing this event. Really wonderful group of speakers here. So just let me get organized for one quick minute. There we go. Okay. Well, anyway, so hello to all of you out there. I wish I could see you, and we were all be able to sense each other's presence better. But anyway, I know you're out there. And I think one of the things that we're all trying to discover now is what is the silver lining of this new context we find ourselves in. And I think for me, the silver lining is that we are able to have a much broader conversation today than we could have ever had if everyone was actually coming to campus. So thank you all for joining us. Today, what I'm going to be doing is talking about our story in decarbonization, what we're doing to improve energy resiliency in light of the changes that are taking place in the physical world and policy world. And also sort of at the end leave with some dilemmas that we're grappling with trying to address, and hope that this is just the beginning of us forming a closer community where we can share what's working and also learn from others to help us as we're all trying to achieve our goals to become more climate and energy resilient. So I like to think of a university campus as a small city, and I'm not sure we always think of them in that way. And so our small city at Stanford, we have about 8,000 acres as our campus. We have about 30,000 people who come on campus every day to do their work or actually live here if you're a student. And we house about 10,000 people, and we have restaurants and we have mechanical shops. So in many ways, we're like a microcosm of small cities. And so we here at Stanford have begun to think of ourselves really as a living lab for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And we've had very ambitious goals really running back for more than a decade. And specifically, I think Famida alluded to these earlier, that our goal is 80% emission reduction, CO2 emissions reductions by 2025 with a 2011 baseline. And that 2011 baseline was peak emissions that ever occurred at Stanford. And the second climate and energy goal specifically is to have 100% renewable electricity. So what I'm going to be is talking about how we've done that, but also in the course of achieving these goals or moving towards achieving these goals, we've also discovered a lot of other factors that really help tremendously with resiliency. And I want to share those. But I have to say that everything that we've done on campus has been driven by the visionary leadership from the very top of the organization to throughout. But I'd like to just highlight two people from Sustainability and Energy Management Organization at Stanford. First, Joe Stegner, the executive director, and was really the visionary behind many of the changes I'll be describing. And then, of course, our own Famida Ahmed Bangert, who's our host for our session today. So thinking about the energy system, so we've got our little small town of people, and we need to provide energy for them. And so here it's divided out into three different categories. One is cooling, the second one is heating, and the third one is power or electricity. And what this is data, this is actual campus data. It covers about a 2-year period. And the way to read this is that for any of the given panels, on the left-hand side, it's midnight, and then on the right-hand side, midnight again. So this is the hour of the day. And then on the left, of course, is the year. And what you can see is we have a fairly intensive cooling demand during the summer, and particularly the summer during the daytime. And the cooling load goes down in winter, not surprising. We find exactly the reverse with the electricity, with the heating, that we need heating during the winter, but very little during the summers. And then we use power, electricity all over the course of the year. The only times we don't use it is when we actually shut down our campus, which happens once a year during the winter time for a couple of weeks. So this is the energy demand we're trying to meet in a way that allows us to dramatically reduce emissions, but also has the reliability and resiliency that we expect of a modern energy system that supports multiple hospitals, as well as all of our campus operations and sophisticated labs and so forth. So now what I want to do is go back to the 2011 peak of emissions and talk about how these were distributed amongst those various categories I've just talked about. So in total, we had 232,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, and about 39% of those were electricity. And I think most of us, when we think about energy demand, we immediately jump to electricity, we think about our cars and so forth. But what we often don't appreciate is that even in our very mild climate, we have very large heating loads. And that's shown here. So for heating and steam, and about 43% of our emissions are actually associated with that. And then the last bit, 18%, this is all other, it's around 6 different categories, and I'm not going to talk about those today. But it just points out that if we want to deeply decarbonize as we do, that we can't just think about electricity. We've really got to focus on heating. And this is a similar pattern to what every individual in California will find in their home by and large. Okay. So what's our strategy then to go about reducing these emissions? So the first one was a commitment to 100% renewable electricity. And in California, we've got a great solar resource, so it's not a surprise that we went the South Solar route. We put about 4.5 megawatts of PV on campus, on rooftops and so forth. But our campus really isn't big enough to meet anywhere near our electricity needs with using the land available to us. So we decided to build a 67 megawatt solar array down south of the campus. And that was installed in 2016. And now we've made a commitment to another 88 megawatts that will be completed in 2021. And that will get us to our 100% of the electricity that we use will be compensated for by this electricity that we have purchased. So that's half of it, roughly. But what are we going to do with all this heating? Most heating is done with natural gas in California. Campuses often have cogen facilities that produce both heat and power. But we decided that we did not want to continue operating our power plant to provide heat. We'd gone all renewable. So what were the options? Well, basically to electrify heating with heat pumps. And there's a picture of that on the left there. This is our new central energy facility. I hope if you haven't come to visit, please do. And the key are these heat recovery chillers, which allow very efficient operation, large-scale thermal storage, which I'll get back to, and then automated control, so that it sort of runs on autopilot and takes into account electricity prices and forecasted demands and so forth. So between these two things, these are the primary technological strategies for reducing these emissions. And so what's happened? So there's 2011 and here's 2019. We've had a 72% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and the remaining emissions, about 73,000 tons, are shown over there. And again, we're working on this, and with the addition of our new PV array, this will go down even substantially further. So that's where we are. So, really extremely successful in the regard of reducing emissions. But as I mentioned, a key to this was we had very large scale thermal storage. Well, what is that? It's basically tanks of cold water and tanks of hot water. And what we've discovered is that not only having this large scale storage capacity key to the efficiency gains that we made in the process of putting this in, but it's also provided all kinds of flexibility that allows us to be much more resilient. And the benefit of thermal storage is that you get all the flexibility of, say, battery storage, but it comes at about 1/5 of the cost. So now I'd like to talk about some of the discoveries we've really made by the integration of the academic side of the campus together with the lands, buildings, and real estate part of the campus who run the central energy facility and so forth, is that the flexibility provided by this thermal storage provides much greater resilience. And the key to this is the availability of a huge amount of data, advanced analytics, and optimization and control. And if you think about Stanford University and what the university is good at, well, our computer science department, management science and engineering, anyway, tremendous capability. So what's really emerged is a partnership between the sustainability and energy management office and the academic part of the campus. And I'll just quickly go through some of these benefits. We, of course, know that by controlling loads, you can reduce the demand charges, which are often a very significant part of electricity bills. We can also avoid peak pricing by taking advantage of the flexibility provided by this thermal storage. We also discovered that we could provide demand response services to the grid, so that has benefit to CAISO and PG&E and so forth. But it can also generate revenue for the campus by participating in these programs. We also have been able to show that if you run your central energy facility, for example, largely in the middle of the day when you've got all this clean solar power, you can actually reduce your emissions by about even 40% more than we've been able to do today by what we call carbon-aware scheduling. Another example, we all lived through this last summer. Remember those terrible, terrible hot days? And to a certain degree, having large-scale cool water storage helps you adapt to extreme heat events, particularly short ones. And then the other thing we realized is that, again, because of all the flexibility this thermal storage provides, we could actually integrate about 25% of all cars that come to campus could be plugging into charging, and it still wouldn't appreciably increase our electricity bill due to an increased demand charge, just because we could change when we're actually filling up the hot and cold water tanks. So these are just some of the things we've learned by the close cooperation across campus. So what are challenges ahead? Of course, we want to get to zero emissions at some point, and we've got some way to go on that. Another challenge is that we found that multi-day heat events with high humidity put a tremendous amount of stress on the cooling system. So we need to sort of come to grips with how do you design a system that can both meet peak cooling demands, but on the other hand is efficient and cost effective for providing the cooling that we need 98% of the time. And I think this is a challenge we're all going to face, is how do you deal with peaks in a resilient and cost-effective way. Another thing we're grappling with is what are we going to do about power shutoffs due to wildfire risks? We made a decision to not have on-site generation, electricity generation, and we wanted to go 100% renewable, but there wasn't enough room on campus, so we have to rely on the electric grid. So when the power shuts off, that's a huge challenge to us. We've got the hospital, we've got all the campus buildings, we've got sensitive lab equipment and experiments and so forth. So this is a real challenge. And then finally, just sort of closing the loop on a little bit of the context for today with COVID-19, we're starting to hear about guidelines for increasing the airflows through buildings to try to reduce exposures, and also to severely limit the amount of recycle of building air that can be done. And all of these are going to drive increases both in heating and cooling demand.
A reminder of the time.
Okay. Anyway, just wrapping up. So we've started a new initiative at Stanford called Zero Emissions Energy Solutions that fundamentally, it started with the collaboration between the energy and sustainability management activities at Stanford and the academic side. And we would very much like to partner with many of you who are grappling with these same issues to really create a learning community so we can accelerate the pace of decarbonization and increasing resiliency. So thank you very much. And I'm done, and I will stop sharing my screen so you can move on to the next person.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you for your insightful remarks. Policy, resiliency background, a little bit of a vignette presentation on energy resiliency ideas. Our next speaker moving on is going to focus on vulnerability assessment for climate resiliency. Jasneet Sharma, Director of Sustainability in Santa Clara County. Her expertise includes climate change and adaptation, land use and environmental planning, health policy, smart growth, sustainable food systems, and community engagement. Prior to joining Santa Clara County, Jasneet served as the Climate Resiliency Specialist with the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, where she led the county's climate adaptation initiatives focused on building resiliency to climate-related risks. Very relevant. Welcome, Jasneet.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Famita. Just confirming that you can hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So again, thank you all for the invitation. I'm Jasneet Sharma with the county's Office of Sustainability. With my presentation, I'm hoping to focus more on kind of the first part of resiliency planning, which we call vulnerability assessments. And I'd like to speak a little bit to vulnerability assessment, but what I'd really like to do is elaborate on really what exactly are vulnerability assessments and why we undertake them or how we can utilize them through the example of the Silicon Valley 2.0 tool that the county developed and launched in 2015. So just a quick reminder, when you talk about resilience planning, there are typically 3 steps to it. You start with assessment, you move into more of the planning, and then into the implementation. I think some of what Sally was sharing in her presentation right before me was really the implementation, and there were fabulous examples. I was quickly making notes of some things we want to loop back with Sally on applying here at the county as well. But really, oftentimes when you think about resilience planning, what you're really trying to do is for you to protect both people and places, the infrastructure that we depend on, we first really need to understand kind of how a climate hazard or a variable will affect our residents, our businesses, and the community services that we all rely on. And using that, you kind of try to understand the scale and the extent of both the exposure and the risk that we will face both now, but also in the future. And then you develop strategies or solutions to protect the community. But a big portion of this is also sharing information with a wide variety of audiences and stakeholders, both to raise awareness, but also to promote action. This is just a very quick way of trying to show you what the different components of an assessment or a vulnerability assessment could look like. You're often starting by thinking through, okay, what are your data inputs? You're usually thinking about, okay, what climate variables are you going to consider? Many of them, Noon Tara mentioned in her presentation: sea level rise, creek or riverine flooding, wildfire, extreme heat, kind of droughts and water conditions, extreme storms. So you start by thinking through what variables you want to look at, and then what scenarios are you going to look at: a 2030, 2050, end of century scenario. So identifying some of those, and then moving into your asset and community mapping. This is really where you're identifying what infrastructure you have out there, but also looking at your community, the demographic and the socioeconomic conditions that currently exist within your community. The vulnerability piece really is where, again, you're looking at the exposure, which is like a quick analysis of how exposed is a particular infrastructure going to be to a climate variable. With sensitivity analysis, you're trying to identify, well, what's the degree of impact? If you are going to be exposed, like what's that degree of impact you expect to face? And then the adaptive capacity is really, are there some existing conditions or strategies that exist currently that can allow you to adapt the infrastructure to be able to cope with the anticipated challenges? Risk analysis, it's often done, now I'm seeing it more and more, especially the economic risk analysis, is trying to understand is what are the economic consequences that would happen if no action is taken. Loss of infrastructure, which are direct impacts, but indirect impacts are often not being able to move goods or labor or lost time in travel and productivity. So many of those aspects. And of course, the adaptation strategies is really trying to think through is, as Nuntara was saying, is how do you, like, what are those strategies you put in place? How do you operationalize it and institutionalize it within the work that you're doing? So I'll move into the example of Silicon Valley 2.0 as a way to further elaborate on vulnerability assessment. This is a local example from Santa Clara County and how the county approached it a couple of years ago. It was launched in 2015, and the tool was developed to provide both the county and jurisdictions within the county with the ability to both estimate the impacts of climate change, but also on properties and infrastructure within their communities. And then it also wanted to identify a set of adaptation strategies to implement. It was funded by the Strategic Growth Council at that time, and we had a really wide stakeholder and a partner engagement process. We had cities from the county that were part of it, and a lot of nonprofit and public agency and stakeholder groups as well. This is slide just shows the 4 type of climate variables that are included in the tool. So sea level rise, it is the study uses approximately 6 inches by 2030, 11 inches of sea level rise by mid-century, and 36 by end of century. Riverine flooding, it is difficult to anticipate at this time kind of how this increased precipitation, what it's going to mean from a riverine flooding standpoint completely. One way you can assess that is by looking at what we call a 100-year flood or a 500-year flood. So that's, at this time, the tool takes into account the occurrence of a 100-year flood to understand how our creeks and rivers will get impacted. And then with wildfire and extreme heat as well, it takes the data directly from the Cal Adapt, the state tool that's been created, as a way to then model and replicate the impacts in Santa Clara County. This slide is showing you all the different assets that the tool uses as part of the data input. So all of the land use and buildings, the communication towers, wastewater and water treatment facilities, landfill, all of our transportation networks, going from airports to roads, bigger highways to smaller highways as well, even our transit systems, all of our energy and transmission systems as well, and then shoreline protection, meaning existing dikes or levees that we already have in place that provide shoreline protection currently. I've included this slide, even though this is something that's actually not included in the SV 2.0 tool, and this is something we hope to remedy pretty soon, hopefully within this year. But really, we all know that the effects of climate change and sea level rise will not be felt equally by all people. So you have to examine the existing social and economic conditions, as well as how the existing environmental burdens will impact the people that are marginalized at most times. So this is a list of indicators that I've taken from the Adapting to Rising Tides Bay Area report that came out recently. But like I said, we're hoping to actually expand on the tool and include some of these social vulnerabilities into the SV 2.0 tool as a way to analyze really where are our social vulnerabilities and our hotspots in the county that we should be targeting our approaches to. I'm quickly just going to share a couple of slides that will show you. So if you go to the SV 2.0 tool, I just wanted to familiarize you with what to expect when you go there. So given here, firstly, is the link for the tool. And when you land on the home page, you'll see that it's really set up as a way for you to go through a vulnerability assessment process for one specific jurisdiction, multiple jurisdictions, or for a countywide scale. So when you land here, you could, go into these tabs which tell you more about climate change in Santa Clara County, like a big picture overview. But really where you want to start doing the vulnerability assessment is you would click on the setup for assessments. And then this is where you would get the option. You can choose a specific city, or you could decide to do the assessment for the full county. And in this case, I've using the example on a countywide scale. This is where you choose your climate variable. I'm going to be choosing wildfire, but if you chose sea level rise, you would then get the option to choose, okay, do you want a 6-inch scenario? Do you want that 1-foot scenario? So it'll ask you a couple of additional questions in order to refine the analysis and the output. So I'm choosing wildfire, and in this example, I have mid-century by 2050. This is a smaller slide. I'm sorry, the view is smaller, but I wanted to give you all an idea of how you would choose all your assets. So again, this was the list of assets that I showed in a previous slide to you, and you can essentially choose which assets you want the results to show up for. And then this is kind of what would show up. This is just a exposure map of wildfire risk in Santa Clara County for the 2050 time scenario. And you'll see with the legend on the side that you get the option to do a satellite view or a county view, and then there are additional options for you to choose from. It also gives you this information in a report format where it's actually going to show you, okay, what's the vulnerability for the assets that you chose? Is it low? Is it high? How many of the assets within that asset are at risk? So for energy substations, you can see there are 12 of them in all, and the risk factor is very high. And this one shows you the asset vulnerability. You can actually see the location of some of these as well to further be able to identify which ones are affected or which assets, the electric towers, are not going to be affected, or the transmission towers. And this was the risk analysis that I mentioned, is that it actually then gives you some numbers on replacement costs or cost to replace the damaged asset, the impacts you might feel from a loss of fiscal revenue, so loss of property and sales tax revenue, any changes in operational cost, and that disruption of economic activity as well. And it uses that to kind of come up with a final number for each of the assets.
Please go on for the next presenter.
Thank you. The adaptation strategies you can see in the guidebook. And I just wanted to close out by kind of speaking a little bit to the action and the implementation. Is how we're currently starting to use this is a lot of what Nyuntara was saying was local governments have to take on their own vulnerability assessment, put them into planning and adaptation. So we are starting to share this data with our local jurisdictions in the county. We are hoping to come together both with the jurisdictions and other partners to develop a more coordinated regional strategy or a resilience strategy for the county. But then also thinking through about the outreach and the messaging is how do you raise that awareness both among decision makers, but also the public on what the impacts they are going to experience so they can start to be better prepared. And then implementing these demonstration projects. The example here is showing an example from Highway 9. And then also having a list of prioritized projects so you can actually secure grant funding when those become available. Again, thank you for the opportunity. That's the website for the Office of Sustainability, and my email if you need to follow up with me as well. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jasneet. A very helpful tool. And in fact, as every organization moves forward with their own vulnerability assessment, they can build on the regional assessment and do a higher resolution study to understand the detailed impacts. So with that, we'd like to move on. We have two more presentations before we go to our Q&A around 1:40 this afternoon. Next, we have two speakers from San Francisco International Airport. One of the first organizations whose longstanding resiliency, caught our attention when we were thinking about this panel. SFO is in its 93rd year of operation and is one of nation's busiest airports, usually. The first speaker will be Erin Cook, Director of Sustainability at SFO. Erin is responsible for partnering with the airport community to co-design, manage, and administer the sustainability policies and practices. Erin oversees sustainability investments and capital improvement projects and cultivates the airport sustainability and environmental management plans. Her colleague will follow, Rinaldi Wubo. He will speak next. Mr. Wubo is the project manager of SFO's Shoreline Protection Program, which endeavors to protect the airport against future storm events and sea level rise, and ensure that exceptional airport operations are maintained for years to come. Please welcome our speakers from San Francisco International Airport. Welcome.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to feature SFO's Climate Resilience and Action Planning portfolio today, and to do so among so many practitioners and academic leaders. As for me, I'm kind of reminded of the Director General of the World Health Organization when he said on March 11th, when officially defining COVID-19 as a pandemic, let's all look to each other because we need each other. So, just as we look out for each other and we really need our essential workers, we also need this really strong sense of community to thrive during this current crisis, but also the one that is running in parallel and impacting our climate. So thanks for the opportunity to be part of this community today. This is really essential because as our shared climate continues to change, nearly all, including all of our San Francisco Bay shoreline communities, will need to adapt in order to build social, economic, and ecological resilience. Airports specifically as business, multimodal transit interchanges, and also as employment nodes are an essential piece of the regional and national infrastructure for the communities that we serve. And as an essential service provider to a wide range of stakeholders and users, the airport infrastructure and its operations must have high levels of availability, reliability, and resilience, which COVID-19 tests today. Covered today will be SFO's framework and roadmap to protect itself and the region serving as a mega hub, supporting the 5th most visited U.S. city by international visitors. I'll do so with a backdrop of acknowledging, though not to the topic of today, SFO remains equally committed to mitigation measures that maximize our emissions reduction as our commitment to reduce our contribution to climate change. SFO is the only airport globally to have a 000 goal of achieving zero net energy, carbon neutrality, and zero waste. And we are making really great progress towards accomplishing these goals. We've reduced our emissions by 41% off our baseline. We've activated the first zero net energy airport facility in the world, and we launched a zero waste concessions program that bans single-use plastics. But more of this can be found on our website by SFO, and we'll move forward with our resilience journey. So back one slide. Thank you, Rinaldi. Relative to our critical infrastructure, just to give the context, and sorry, one more back, Rinaldi, thank you. SFO's context is really complex. We're owned and operated by the City and County of San Francisco, but we're located in another county surrounded by multiple transit and government authorities. We have a 5,000-acre campus, 14 million square feet of existing facilities, and we provide the region with $8 billion in economic activity. And we continue to recognize our responsibility in protecting our facilities is not just so we can continue to provide an exceptional passenger experience for our 58 million passengers that choose SFO as the origin of a once-in-a-lifetime journey, but also to the 46,000 people who work at SFO on their journey to a better quality of life. Next slide. So safeguarding SFO isn't a journey we're initiating now. It's nearly 40 years in the works. It launched in the 80s to protect our 8 miles of shoreline perimeter, to protect our property and also facilities from potential flood hazards, and also safeguard adjacent cities. Rinaldi will be speaking about this project later today. But given that we have a great deal at stake, SFO does not work on climate hazards independently. We are highly intentional about forging partnerships with key agencies and thought leaders at both the local and state level, our partners shown here on the left, and also nationally and internationally, our partners represented here on the right. We do this by serving and contributing to relevant working groups and jointly pursuing grants, but also inviting their voices, perspectives, and priorities in our own work. Each of these partners are uniquely activated to work at SFO via its resilience and adaptation framework, which is shown here. We're engaging with key partners to mutually identify and analyze vulnerabilities, review and remediate risks to ensure our business continuity that serves as an economic engine to the region. And I'll also share a few specific examples of how we're applying this framework today through these key partnerships. So our first example is shown on the next slide. As our climate continues to change, more extreme weather and climate-related events are expected. While the frequency, intensity, spatial extent, duration, and timing of these events are expected to increase, our socioeconomic system will be transformed at a much more slower and incremental pace. Most airports need to confront these geo-specific vulnerabilities to these events as the risks of flooding, flight disruptions, and also cancellations will continue to increase. But we can't do this in a vacuum. SFO is 13 feet above sea level, and so are the cities that surround us. Rising sea level is more than just flooding on tarmacs, and resiliency is more than just sea level. So to build a complete picture of our vulnerabilities, we partnered with departments across the city and county of San Francisco to develop a comprehensive climate and resilience plan. This document forecasts the future and also recognizes the systemic impacts of climate change, but also other hazards like pandemics. It acknowledges that we aren't just working to safeguard our shoreline via adaptation projects, we're also focused first on further exploring the coalescence of impacts that we need to address our critical facility, and two, and also in parallel, building and retrofitting robust assets that can thrive in future scenarios. All of these are being tested right now as we're responding to a global pandemic. Next slide. One project noted in our city's resilience plan is SFO's partnership with our Port, Public Utilities Commission, and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories to supercompute sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme precipitation to more granularly within a 1 mile radius, analyze the coupling of these events to inform future infrastructure planning. Next slide. The study specifically shown on the prior slide will help SFO prioritize and respond to the cumulative risks of SFO's business and operations through a future resilience plan that both offers a detailed investigation of mitigation options, but an assessment of our costs and benefits of these options. This will inform our active campus-wide planning and also specifically allow us to be more resilient from an infrastructure readiness and climate readiness perspective. SFO is deep into a multi-year master utility infrastructure while also a distributed energy resource study to ensure continuity of our energy supply and redundancy to accommodate projected growth and also forecasted climate hazards and risks. We're also actively activating advanced recycled water, sustainable aviation fuel storage, retro commissioning projects, EV charging and banking projects all across our campus, and expect many of these to continue, even as we recover from this current economic crisis. And this is all in the backdrop of SFO's current $7.4 billion capital plan that's grounded in energy use intensity, contract requirements, biodiversity and green infrastructure standards, and the first in the country sustainable planning, design, and construction guidelines that were developed for airports. Next slide. As an airport, SFO is a hub for providing direct, indirect, and spin-off economic activities to the region with a total economic contribution to the Bay Area of over $63 billion and 300,000 jobs. And for this reason, we are working to ensure the solvency and long-term viability of our campus and infrastructure assets to sustain these benefits to our region. But we're not doing so alone. We're both leveraging our city's sea level rise guidance for capital planning projects and working to expand it with other large corporate campus owners through the Bay Area Corporate Resilience Council that launched last year. Beyond the mission and priorities that are shown here on this slide, we're creating expanded infrastructure resilience guidelines that can be consistently applied regionally. These initiatives mentioned today, including on this slide and prior to, are our new climate reality, but also will help to shape our post-COVID-19 relief efforts. SFO is activating a campus that can continue to serve our domestic and international guests, ensure high quality employment for generations to come, all scaffolded by buildings that benefit the environment of now and also tomorrow. And I'm going to hand it over to Rinaldi, an exceptional project manager that I'm honored to get to work with to give more detail on our shoreline protection program specifically.
Hi, thank you, Erin, for such a great introduction. Thank you, Director Famita, for introducing and for inviting SFO to be part of the panel. I really am humbled to be part of the panel. So I like the segue because we go from leading from the macro to the micro, and we're going to talk about what SFO is doing on a program or a project level. My name is Rinaldi Wibowo, and I'm the project manager managing the airport's shoreline protection program. Today's presentation, I'll show you the following: a bit of history about the airport and background, current challenges with regard to coastal flooding, considering extreme weather events and future sea level rise, the proposed solutions that we've developed with the FFO team, and then finally, opportunities for the larger Bay Area community for greater resilience in the Bay. So as Erin mentioned earlier, SFO is a large hub airport. It's in San Mateo County. And so I'm just gonna do a little laser here. So San Francisco is actually to the right of the slide, north. You see the Pacific Ocean to the west. This is the airport itself. So, south of us, cities are Millbrae and Burlingame, and then north of us, South San Francisco, as well as San Bruno. And then right to the west of us is this line that you can see. It's actually Highway 101 to the west. So would you believe that the airport is actually over 90 years old? We've been in existence since 1927, and we've provided exceptional airport service to our communities and have kept pace with the development of commercial aviation. What it started out as was a single airstrip, one, built on dirt in a cow pasture, serving just 20 passengers in the first month. Is now one of the most innovative and busiest airports. We're actually 7th busiest in the US and 24th busiest in the world. It's a key gateway for not only just North American cities in terms of linkage, but also a key gateway to Europe and Asia. And we talked about the number of passengers we serve and the economic benefits. So what risks do we have? As Erin mentioned, we're very close to the water. So again, this is the campus itself. And we have about 8 miles of shoreline along the San Francisco Bay. 6 miles of what we have actually has existing protection, as Erin mentioned, either through berm walls, concrete walls, or sheet pile walls. And we're looking at 2 different maps and models. The left, what you see, which is kind of greenish, is more of a current coastal flood risk from flooding. And on the right side is looking into the future, modeling what it looks like to the end of the century. So going back to the one on the left, it's a stark contrast. So this map is put out by FEMA in 2015. The last set of maps were put out in 1984, which is a long time. It's decades in between. And the 1984 map showed no flooding. And what you're seeing here is basically the teal blue represents a large extent of the airport that's mapped within what they call a 100-year floodplain, sometimes also described as a 1% annual chance of flooding. Looking at the future, many scientists and the latest science have shown that and confirmed that extreme weather events have and will become even more frequent with significant upticks in potential floods. And it's going to be compounded by future sea level rise. So what NOAA has put together is a web mapping visualization tool to look at coastal flooding. And you'll see basically larger areas susceptible to coastal flooding and also darker areas showing the increased depth of flooding. So what are we doing about it? Seeing there's risks, SFO has been developing what we call our Shoreline Protection Program, or as in any good project, you need a 3-letter acronym, SPP. The key objective of the program is to protect the airport from flooding from both a 100-year flood event and also future sea level rise. The key objective is to plan for and construct the flood protection system that can be integrated, protecting us, but also integrated in the regional flood protection solution. And we do realize that many of the agencies are at different stages, whether they're at the stage of vulnerability assessment that Jasmine is describing, or feasibility study, or conceptual design. And it's important to note that while we're trying to protect the airport and ensure that our exceptional airport operations will continue for many years to come, our team is working really hard with each of these agencies as our neighbors to look for opportunities to create regional resiliency against coastal flooding.
Please wrap up in a few minutes for the next presenter.
So SFO is a very land-constrained airport. The FAA basically establishes a lot of safety requirements for the airport operations, which includes clearances required between runways and taxiways, and then also landing and takeoff glide slows for safe operation. So given that SFO is a very land-constrained airport, those clearances doesn't allow for much room to construct our shoreline protection system. To build it, we'll need to fill a narrow ribbon of the bay around the bayfront perimeter. In addition, to meet the glide slope clearances at the end of the runways, we'll need additional bay fill at the ends of the runways. So while the airport is very supportive of nature-based solutions to mitigate flooding elsewhere in the bay, we're not in favor of them at the airport because these nature-based solutions could create wildlife habitat and create wildlife attractants, especially those that relate to birds. And so for our shoreline protection program, SFO is proposing a hard armored solution, which is the same type of solution that we have currently along most of our shoreline. This is the last slide. So while SFO is proposing hard armoring around the airport to protect existing airport assets for safety reasons, we're actively looking at improving regional resilience in terms of wetland restoration in the bay. What does that mean? The bays are very unique in terms of its geography and geomorphology. There's only one bay area in the world. You'll see to the north is predominantly a lot of ag land, in the south, which is a significant amount of salt ponds. And these are really excellent opportunities for wetland restoration. The South Bay in particular, where the bay kind of pinches down and is most susceptible to tidal amplification and also wave action with future sea level rise. It's in these areas to the north and south that would benefit the most by restoring these wetlands to attenuate or buffer wave energy and to reduce potential for coastal flooding. To help realize these regional benefit, our team has been working with the South Bay salt ponds and have been advocating for a mitigation bank or in lieu fee program. That way, a lot of public agencies can participate as well in terms of doing their restoration or their resiliency project while at the same time benefiting the bay. So SFO has come a long way from its history, from about 90 years ago as a one airstrip, one airport building, 20 passengers a month, to now serving the entire bay, and as a prominent link not only to the among cities in the US, but also a gateway to Europe and Asia. And as our team endeavors to protect the airport against future storm events and future sea level rise and ensure airport operations, we want to make sure that the success translates to a Bay Area success as well for the region. Thank you. I'll turn it over now to Director Famida.
Thank you, Aaron and Rinaldi. That's a lot of really good information to pack in a short period of time. We understand there's a lot to share, so we'll try to get to some of it during Q&A. We're coming to the end of our panel, and to round it up, we've invited Russell Furr, Associate Vice Provost of Environment, Health, and Safety at Stanford. The pandemic is at the forefront of all our minds, and there has been a lot of literature connecting the dots between the pandemic as the current resiliency effort that we're taking part in and how that might relate to the future and the various climate action resiliency efforts coming our way. Mr. Furr serves in various capacities. He is the senior most official in the management of environment and health and safety programs for the university community, including the offices of research safety, emergency management, and the fire marshal, as well as the environmental protection program of the Occupational Health Center. He's been at the forefront of the pandemic response and look forward to his insights. Thank you so much for patiently waiting, Russell.
Yeah, thank you, Famida. I appreciate it. So I'll jump right in. So as Famida mentioned, I oversee environmental health and safety, includes emergency management, business continuity, that's my normal job. For the past couple of months, my job has been pandemic response. So Stanford went to a incident command structure to try to deal with the pandemic. And so my role has been to lead that process. So I thought today, just to touch on a few issues, the lessons we're seeing from the pandemic response that I think apply to this larger conversation about resiliency. And so I'm really focusing on the resiliency as an organization, and an organization as part of a community. Clearly, the problems have a lot of overlap. We have the situation of exponential growth of a problem with limited capacity to deal with it. Means we have to take swift action, but we have a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, what's going to happen down the line. And really, if we wait until we're feeling the effects of this, it's going to be too late. And so I think that holds true for both the pandemic and for challenges of climate change. And so when we were thinking about this ahead of time, and we started planning last summer for public health issues like this. We had previous planning, but we had started updating it. One of the lenses we looked at it through was resiliency. It's been something we've been focusing on from emergency management, business continuity standpoint, and really trying to think about how can we design our efforts so it supports organizational resiliency. And so a couple of items I just want to touch on that I think attributes of resiliency that I think matter for an organization very quickly. So the first one is that, historically for our programs, we tended to focus on the planning aspect and exercises and working out how would we respond. This idea of stepping back and thinking, how do our efforts contribute to the overall organization and community's resilience, was something we started thinking about. And there was a few attributes that bubbled up. I'm only going to cover a couple here. One of them had to do with connections. And so relationships is obviously key. I think we all know that, and it's key for us to get things done. But when I talk about connections, I'm talking about strategically as an organization, thinking about what are our key functions and how do you make sure those key functions have connections that go beyond the org chart. I'll admit I've historically thought about this and thought about it in terms of, okay, I need to have connections with all of these program areas. But it's not necessary for any one person to have those connections. In fact, that's not a super resilient system. Idea being, can we make sure all these organizational functions are connected? So for my organization, it's not just me, it's the whole team. And as long as I have someone on my team I'm working closely with, and they have a strong connection with another organization or another community group outside of us, that forms the strong network, and we can respond quickly. That's been key, both because of how quickly the pandemic's forced us to move. And so obviously you want to be able to communicate out, and you want to be able to draw on all these assets. But it's also been key for how we understand what our possible decisions could be. Normally in the university and society at large, it takes a long time to get action. And so the connections and key connections allows us to both to speed up how quickly we can move, but also how quickly we can take in information about what the impacts are going to be. Second attribute, a factor that comes up when we think about resiliency, and this came actually from looking at fields of ecology and ecosystems. One of the things that attributes they have in common, resilient systems have frequent disturbances. And so in the environmental world, that's fine. But in emergency management, we don't really want to be creating problems just to make our university more resilient. And so the idea of using the planning process and as a learning opportunity is really what we started to focus on. That was both planning ahead of time, but it's also been planning as we've moved through this pandemic. So just to give you sort of a small example, one area we're looking at now is what do we do for fall? So when can we bring students back? When can we have a regular residential program? Do they have to stay online? Can it be in person? And so in some aspect, we can just look at it from a public health perspective. We can look at the risk. We can look at it from a financial perspective. But the idea of adaptive planning is we also want to set that up the fall so that we learn, because we're going to have to do winter, and then we're going to have to do the following quarter, because we don't know when we're going to have this problem fully solved. And so that one's a little bit out, but in each of the decisions we've done, this idea of trying to plan in ways that we learn from the process, and also so that we can quickly adapt and shift to something else. On the planning, and this is sometimes a struggle, is people will want to think of the plan as telling them what they will do. And so what we've been trying to do, and we think is important, especially in a resilient system, is thinking about the planning is helping to get everyone to think of the problem in the same way, and then to give us a shared starting point. If we have a shared starting point and understanding what we expect to happen, whatever does happen, we can now learn from the process, and we're in a better position to shift our plan. And then the last point I just want to bring up is this idea of behavior. Pandemic response and the climate challenge, they both, obviously at their heart, they're dealing with human behavior. It's a complex problem, and this idea of a complex problem is one that whatever you do on day one changes what's going on day two, and changes what options you have on day three. And so that comfort level with understanding you can't be right. And so that has been a real challenge for us as we've gone through responding to this pandemic. Things that we would decide where we thought we're getting ahead of the curve, by 2 days later, it seemed too small, and we had to scramble and react again and move forward. So that idea of we can't wait until we have the decision we can guarantee is right. We have to go with the decision that just makes it better, except that we'll have to adjust and move forward was one of the key, really feel like it's one of the key aspects of this process that I think that overlaps. This picture, by the way, is, people may recognize it, it's from Florida when they closed, the beaches were closed, but they were still open in one county. And this idea of behavior, we often think of as individual human behavior, but it's also stepping back and think of the policy and decision makers as having their own behavior. In this case, the decision for one county to leave the beaches closed and one to leave it open obviously has a big impact, and will have downstream effects over for the whole community as a large, not just the one that decided to keep it open. So with that, I will stop sharing and open it up for return it back to Famita. Thank you.
Insights from policy to planning to tools to experiences. So let us all come together, and thanks to all 300 plus of you who are still with us towards the tail end of this learning summit. A lot of questions have come in, and I'm going in the order of both sequence and topic. And I invite everybody to join in to respond, please. COVID-19, of course, again, in the forefront of everybody's mind. Continuing with that theme of behavior change, this question from Tony, COVID-19 has significantly altered our behavior, and climate change remains a much greater threat. Why don't we change our behavior as much in response?
So I would say that's a great question. You know, I think the challenge for climate change, of course, is that it's moved slower, and so people do not recognize it as an immediate threat. I think for the pandemic, it was also slow moving, and we didn't see that shift. So our public health officials helped make that shift, but in terms of the community having some buy-in, it didn't happen until they had a feeling of fear about their personal well-being. Yeah. And I think that's going to be a challenge with climate change, because even as the effects get greater, people will have a harder time making that link between the impact and the cause. In this case, it's very easy. We point to a virus and we can say this is what's causing it. And so people can make that direct connection. So, but how to overcome it, I don't know. That's a harder issue.
Others?
So Mira, I can add to, I think what Russell said is there's a lot of actually a lot of publications and news articles out there right now that are drawing parallels between COVID and climate change, and how already the systems that we are putting in place is pretty much what we need from in terms of responding and preparing for climate change. So there are a lot of similarities there. I think it's what Russell said. It's the sense of the immediate problem is COVID is right here, right now. And I think just as human beings, it's tough for us to kind of think out into the future and plan ahead for it. I think that's the challenge. But it's also an opportunity. I think that now that people have kind of seen the kind of both the disruption and the impacts that something like this can have, I think it's kind of on us to call out the fact that as we are thinking of our recovery plans, can we identify solutions that can have co-benefits from a climate standpoint as well? So if you're looking at, the economy, can it have more of a green economy lens to it, and thinking through which were the communities that were most impacted, like what meeting their needs, but from that resilience lens. So it's certainly an opportunity as well.
Maybe I'll offer a thought as well, if you can hear me. I think that more and more people are experiencing climate change in their lives, and they can point to some event where, flooding or fires or whatever. And I think people are starting to make that connection. I think one of the things that's additionally challenged by the climate change issue is that there are certain things that are within your control. For example, you can choose to eat a less carbon intensive diet. Maybe if you live in the right kind of house, you could put a PV panel on your house. But a lot of the things that we need to do in the energy system to transform it to reduce emissions are more indirect. We need to support policies that will drive, much more rapid and deeper adoption of renewable generation, as an example. And we need policies that get people to invest in large-scale energy storage. So there's the connection between climate change and personal life. And then the second thing is the path to action is not always so direct. So I think that's a second challenge that we face, even as awareness grows.
Great. Thank you for that question. We'll move on. There is one from policy, so perhaps this is for Nuntara. How would engineers working on specific technological solutions work with the government officials or policymakers to make sure that technology is moving forward? So if we could connect that to the framework that's available from the policy angle now, how open is it to technological solutions, and how does that collaboration work?
Yeah, I can touch on this, but I also think, other panelists and Sally may be interesting your perspective as well. I think right now, we from the kind of state side definitely looking to all solutions, and that we need all solutions on at the table right now, both the technological as well as governance, kind of related to the last question, the importance of systems thinking and kind of interdisciplinary work that is needed really to respond on the mitigation as well as the climate adaptation and resilience side. So, in terms of really finding the technological solutions, I think there's a really important space between policy and that technological deployment side of things. I think, just from a quick two areas I would point. One is the state, but also, not just the state. There are other investment in, institutions that are providing investment, including research institutions, federal agencies, philanthropy, but really driving research that is helping deploy technology in marketplace that is really critical. So linking from kind of the research into deployment kind of process or paradigm is really important. And I think, on being able to understand along that process where there are policy barriers that are standing in the way of that kind of rapid deployment is something we're very, very interested in. And so I think that conversation is happening in state research programs that are investing in technological solutions and helping to tease out some of those policy barriers that are in the way. And then I think one of the others is really thinking about maybe stepping back in terms of what we mean by research and who is involved in research, and making sure that communities and end users are involved in research processes, because a lot of those barriers to deployment aren't just technological, right? They're behavior change, their policy, it's a whole combination of things. And so really, from our perspective, really trying to set up research and that collaborative decision-making space so we can tease some of those out. But yeah, I'll end there. I'm curious if other panelists here have thoughts from your perspective.
Yeah, maybe I'll just weigh in. I think the really great news is that today, solar panels, wind turbines can provide some of the cheapest electricity possible. Battery storage is getting to be cheaper and cheaper all the time. It's still kind of expensive, but there are applications where it's cost effective. Electric vehicles are starting to become cost competitive by 2025. Total cost of ownership will be lower for EVs. So we have all these technologies, but I liked your comment about systems, that really the challenge is that we don't have the system, that investing piece by piece by piece in a piecemeal approach is not going to get us where we need to be. We need to start thinking about the whole system and how it fits together, and the information technology. And that's something we're not really used to doing. And there are many more actors, so it's just more complex. I loved Russell's, his statement about, well, things are complex, meaning, decisions we make today are going to influence what the decisions we make the day after and the day after. And this is a very complex system involving human behavior, all those things you mentioned. So I really applaud the systems approach that you laid out.
All right, we will take two more questions. The next one seems on regional planning tools. So Jasneet, maybe let's start with you, and Aaron, perhaps you could comment. The Silicon Valley 2.0 tool is very interesting. Is this equivalent or available for other Bay Area counties for use? So if you could comment on that, and maybe Aaron, you could talk about the tools that SFO might have used for vulnerability study.
Absolutely. So yes, the tool is publicly available, and the link was in the slides that I presented. I'm sure maybe if the slides get posted, we can certainly share that, or they can follow up with me. So it's available for anyone to use. If the question was more from a standpoint of wanting access to the data in order to conduct your own vulnerability assessment, then we would suggest that you reach out to us so we can better understand kind of what your need is, and we can certainly find ways to make that data available to you as well. But other than that, please, we actually want you to go there and play around with the assessment and better understand kind of what the risks in the county are. And also, if you're interested in the adaptation and resilience process, then reach out to us.
I would add on for community people who are maybe calling in from other communities outside of Santa Clara. The state has invested and has provided some really valuable resources as well. So I would highlight CalAdapt, which Jasneet mentioned in her presentation. It's caladapt.org, caladapt-.org, or no, cal/adapt. .org. And it provides downscaled climate projection data at a very fine resolution. We're very lucky in California to have that type of data available, but statewide. And you can interact with different tools there. So you could look at an extreme precipitation tool or extreme heat tool. So it provides that information statewide, and you can look at it by different geographies. It doesn't do the guided process that the Silicon Valley 2.0 tool does. But I do want to highlight that through the work we're doing in our office, we're actually working on a process just now. And so we're looking to release additional resources later on this year by linking the state's adaptation planning guide, which guides a similar type of process to what Jasneet mentioned in adaptation planning, and really embedding that in our adaptation clearinghouse and providing linkages to the data that are in CalAdapt. So we have definitely heard, especially for those of you who are maybe calling in, listening in, who work for local governments or other community members involved in planning, that you really want to be able to come to one site to access the resources and needs that you want. So on the state side, we're really trying to move in that direction by bringing guidance, decision support tools, and case studies together in one place.
Great. All right. Oh, sorry, Erin, please go ahead.
That's okay, just because you flagged it for me, and I've now had the chance to participate in 2 separate adaptation planning exercises, both when I worked for a city previously in developing the Adaptation 2.0, Silicon Valley 2.0 program that was mentioned in Santa Clara County, which was much more of kind of a customizable framework, a tool that is very informative but prescriptive, and then also more on a larger kind of broad scale planning exercise, looking at updating a hazard mitigation tool that existed within San Francisco. I think both really offer unique frameworks that can be leveraged by communities that are looking to understand the way that different large counties can reflect and develop vulnerability assessments, and also apply them to the context of their regions. As was also mentioned, the Adaptation Clearinghouse has been incredibly helpful, as for us has been the tool that was developed with BCDC ART, adapting to rising tides, and then also the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas that was just released by SPUR. In my presentation, I didn't mention there are a lot of acronyms. Each of those are actually hyperlinked, if we're able to share the presentation, to those resources that SFO leverages. So imagining there probably aren't too many other airports, but large facility operators. There have been some really great works out of the National Academy of Sciences, for us specifically, ACRP, which is the Airport Cooperative Research Program that we really leaned on, and all of those resources are hyperlinked in the deck that I provided. So hopefully we can get that out to the audience.
Okay, well, we are at time, so I would like to thank all our panelists for joining us for this session on climate action and resiliency. If we were all in person, there would be a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thanks to all our viewers who have stayed with us for a good hour and a half, coursing through the various elements of this complex topic. Hope we've been able to connect some dots for you and inspire you towards action. And thank you again for the staff who've been keeping this going for us. And we're going to follow up with a thank you note with all our attendees for the remaining programs for Earth Week, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So please do expect an email from us. Thank you again. We all wish you good health and peace during the most extraordinary times. So take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.